Frankfurt, Germany. A Jewish ghetto they called the Judengasse, the Jews' lane. A single alley barely 12 feet wide, where 10,000 people lived packed behind walls the city had built specifically to contain them. Residents weren't permitted to own land. They couldn't leave after dark, they couldn't marry without government permission, and they paid a special tax just for existing. Inside that alley, a coin dealer named Mayer Amschel Rothschild was doing something unusual. He wasn't just selling coins, he was studying them, cataloging rare currency, building relationships with European aristocrats who needed an expert, who came to him, because nowhere else could they find someone with his precision and discretion. And he was paying close attention to one thing none of his neighbors were watching: information. Who owned what, who owed whom, which governments were stable, which were about to need money. Not because he was greedy, because he understood before almost anyone else that in the world of finance, information is the asset. Everything else is just the transaction. The Rothschild family is today estimated to be worth somewhere between $350 billion and $2 trillion. The range itself tells you something. They've deliberately made the number impossible to verify. That's not a failure of accounting. That's strategy number one. But here's what nobody tells you. The real story of how the Rothschilds built 250 years of dynastic wealth isn't about conspiracy theories. It's about a specific, deliberate, almost coldly rational system, one that Mayer Amschel Rothschild designed from the ground up and embedded so deeply into the family's DNA that it's still functioning today. Sometime in the early 1800s, Mayer made a decision that had never been made in the history of private banking. He sent his 5 sons to 5 different cities: Nathan to London, James to Paris. Amschel remained in Frankfurt. Salomon went to Vienna, Karl to Naples. Each one established an independent banking house, but they were not independent in any meaningful sense. They wrote to each other constantly in coded language, using private couriers, sometimes carrier pigeons. When news broke anywhere in Europe, the Rothschild network knew about it in every city simultaneously, before any government, before any rival bank, before any newspaper. In an era when information traveled at the speed of a horse, the Rothschilds had effectively built a private intelligence infrastructure. Not for data, for advantage, financial advantage, political advantage, military advantage. They didn't just know things, they knew things first. That's an asymmetric moat that no competitor could replicate, because it took decades to build and was held together by blood. June 18th, 1815. The Battle of Waterloo, Napoleon versus Wellington. The outcome of that single day would determine the direction of European bond markets for years. British government bonds, consols, would either surge if Wellington won or collapse if Napoleon prevailed. The entire London financial community was frozen, waiting. The conventional journey from Belgium to London, 2 to 3 days minimum. Nathan Rothschild's private courier reached him in hours. The popular legend says Nathan walked onto the floor of the London Stock Exchange, looked grim, and began quietly selling British bonds. Traders watched him. If a Rothschild was selling, they reasoned, Wellington must have lost. The market crashed. Panic spread. And then, without spectacle, Nathan's agents swept the floor and bought everything at the bottom. Official news of Wellington's victory arrived shortly after. Bonds surged. The fortune multiplied. While historians dispute the exact theatrics of that day, they cannot dispute the underlying truth. Nathan Rothschild had early information. He traded on it, and more importantly, this wasn't a lucky break. It was the system working exactly as designed. Waterloo was not the origin of the Rothschild method. It was the most famous demonstration of it. Every major hedge fund today pays for private satellite data and alternative information sources for the same reason. The Rothschilds didn't invent information advantage. They built the first institutional infrastructure for it. But the information network was only the first layer. Mayor Amschel Rothschild understood something that most wealthy families never resolve. Building wealth and keeping wealth are completely different problems. He'd watched dynasties collapse within 2 generations, not because of bad investments, but because of dilution. His answer was the family bank. The mechanics were severe in their simplicity. The Rothschild fortune would never be divided and distributed to heirs. It would be held centrally, governed collectively, and accessible only for 3 purposes: education, investment, starting a business. That was it. Family members didn't simply receive money, they borrowed it. They signed for it. They were expected to pay it back. Every generation was taught one principle from birth: you are not the owner of this wealth. You are the steward, the custodian of something that existed before you were born and will exist long after you are gone. That is a structural defense against the entropy that destroys most family fortunes. And, for the critical early decades, Mayer enforced one more rule: marriage stayed inside the family. Cousins married cousins. Not because of tradition, but because of capital. Every time a Rothschild married outside the family, wealth moved outward. The intermarriage policy kept capital concentrated and the network tight for long enough to reach critical mass. Which brings us to the final layer. The Rothschilds didn't just lend money. They financed governments, both sides of conflicts, simultaneously. They financed railway infrastructure across Europe. They stabilized currencies for emerging states. By the mid-1800s, European governments didn't simply work with the Rothschilds. They depended on them. The family had embedded themselves so deeply into the mechanics of sovereign finance that their own continuity was functionally guaranteed by the states they served. A government that destroyed the Rothschild banking house would be destroying its own financial plumbing. That's not banking. That's indispensability. And indispensability is a moat that compounds silently for generations. None of this required luck. It required patience. It required systems. It required a founder willing to think not in years, but in centuries. Mayer died in 1812, before most of what made his family famous had even been built, but he had already embedded the blueprint. The 5 sons, the information network, the family bank, the strategic indispensability, each piece designed to reinforce the others. Most people who come into money ask, how do I grow this? The Rothschilds were asking something else entirely. How do I build something that survives me? 250 years later, the name is still on the door, and the machine is still running. The strategy was never a secret. It was just spoken in a language most people were never taught. If you want to keep going deeper into how central banks actually work and who wrote the rules of the financial system, subscribe. There's more to this story than most people ever see.